Stasa23 here. In today's knife therapy, we're going to talk about why slicey pocket knives are the best. To me, a knife is a tool. It's made to cut things. So why wouldn't I want it to be the best at that? Now, I'm not saying I don't like your thick, overbuilt knives. Those bring me joy as well. But 9 out of 10 times, when I know I'm going to be cutting up a lot of stuff, or I could be cutting up a lot of stuff, I'm going to grab a knife with good cutting geometry, just because it does such a better job, and it's so much easier to do the work, and I get joy out of it. All these knives right here have been reground. I sent them off to different people. Transparent Knives, BGM Knives, and Will Moon did this one right here. And before, they were all, okay slicers, but after the fact, wow. And there's different reasons for that. And we'll talk about some of those in just a second. But I would love to know down in the comments, what type of knives do you like using the most? Do you like your thinly ground knives? Do you like beefy overbuilt knives? Do you pry a lot? When I worked at the plant, at the chemical plant I worked at, I carried, some overbuilt knives with me, but most of the time I usually had 2 knives on me, one that was a good slicer and one that I was going to use for stuff that you shouldn't be using a folding knife for. So let's get into a few things that can make a knife a good slicer. First thing, just like all these right here, their primary bevel, which is this main bevel right here, is ground thin. So your shoulder that's going to be behind the edge is thin as well. If you look at it, you have your edge, and then from here on is this portion right here. The thicker that is, becomes a wedge in your cutting material, depending on what you're cutting. If you're cutting thin cardboard, it's not going to be as big of a difference. If you're cutting 2-ply cardboard and up, you'll start feeling that thickness behind the edge a lot quicker. One other benefit to having a thin primary bevel right here is that whenever you put your edge bevel on here, say you put a 15-degree edge bevel, as you can see, that's still a very small edge bevel. Now, if this was at its original thickness behind the edge, this edge bevel would have probably been up to about right here, and you've wasted all that life of this steel to try to get that edge bevel on there. Now, I say that because whenever you have a 15-degree edge bevel, inclusive on both sides, you're still going to be able to slice pretty darn well, even with a thicker behind the edge knife. And that is evident in most Spydercos. This knife slices very well because it has a full flat grind, and the edge bevel on this thing is around 14 degrees per side. So it's slicing very, very well. Now, once I get into, say, a thick, dense rubber, it's going to start catching behind this edge right here, and you will feel that drag. But for most of your cutting, this thing is going to slice excellent. Now, once that edge bevel starts to dull, the knife is going to be abruptly dull. Unlike something with a thin behind the edge that has a thinness behind the edge that is a lot thinner, once you start to dull this knife out, it's going to continue to feel like it's sharp because it's just using that thin steel right there to go through, kind of like a razor blade. A razor blade is very thin, and even when you start to dull that razor blade out, you can still cut cardboard with it. It's just not going to cut it as cleanly. So, thin primary bevel, a thin secondary bevel. Both of those are recipes for excellent, excellent slicing capabilities. Another thing that could help a knife be a good slicer is your thinner blade stock. This Benchmade Bug Out slices pretty darn well because it has that thin blade stock. Now, it's not the thinnest behind the edge, but that thin blade stock and a decent edge bevel on there will allow it to slice pretty well. Now, this one right here has that same thin edge bevel, same thin blade stock with a thin primary grind. And look how small that edge bevel is on there. And this one right here is at 15 degrees per side. Look at that edge bevel. This one right here is the factory, I want to say 24 maybe degrees or 22 degrees per side. Look at the difference in that edge bevel. This one is going to outperform this one any day. It's a super noticeable difference, and that's something that, I really started to understand when I had two of the same knives, one that was reground, one that's not, cutting side by side, and this one just, man, puts this one to shame. One of the reasons why this Spyderco Chaparral cuts so well, you have super thin blade stock. Look how thin that blade stock is. Anything .10 to .09 and under is a nice and thin blade stock. This thing has the thin blade stock, decent geometry. It's not super thin behind the edge, but it's fairly thin. And then you have the 15 degree per side edge bevel. This thing is a slicing machine. Same goes with, say, an open L knife. You have thin blade stock, thin geometry, and almost a zero grind on there. These things slice like nobody's business. Now, these are just some of the production knives that I own that are excellent slicers, and they are excellent slicers for certain reasons. Like I said before, like this Hogue and this Spyderco Chaparral, excellent slicers. This one's a good slicer because of the thin blade stock, and it's not a super thick edge bevel, but it's a good slicer mainly because it has that thin, geometry of the the blade stock. So it's going to pass through materials a little bit easier. Like I said, this one's just awesome for several reasons. Thin blade stock, decent geometry, and thin edge bevel. That's why this one is an excellent, excellent slicer. Ask anybody who owns one of these, they'll tell you how great they slice. Now, if you're super hard on your knives, these might not be the best choices for you, but that is not always the best use for a knife. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say that I don't cut dumb stuff with my knives sometimes. Yes, I do, and sometimes my knives pay the price for it. But one thing I can say as well is that I've done this one on video. This knife right here has thin blade stock, and it has okay geometry. It's not the thinnest behind the edge at all, but it has a decent edge bevel on it and it's super sharp. And I beat this thing. I beat it, brought it to its limits of what most people, consider abuse to a knife. And it handled it. Did it have some edge damage? Yeah, not bad at all. Nothing that wouldn't come out after the first sharpening. I really, really wish we would see companies, start to make better slicers, because that's what the majority of us use our knives for, is to slice everyday things like cardboard, rope, plastic, carpet, whatever you decide to use your knives on. Most of them are going to perform better with either good geometry, good edge bevels, thin blade stock. At first, I always wondered why this thing still cut really well, because it's pretty thick behind the edge, and the blade stock is not super thin, but it's got a nice hollow on there. But this knife right here is 14 degrees per side. Now, it has a huge edge bevel from the factory, but at 14 degrees per side, this thing slices really, really well, because whenever you're cutting into material, most of the material you're cutting into, the only thing that's touching that material is that apex of this edge. So if this thing's super fine, it's going to get into that material rather easily, and it's going to slice it very well. Now, like I said, once this edge bevel starts to dull up, you're going to feel it abruptly come to a halt, unlike something like this beauty right here that has a 15 degree per side edge bevel on it, and it's nice and thin behind the edge. This thing's going to continue to cut and feel decently sharp, even when it's not, unlike that knife. Now, I find joy in all these knives. Ever since I started doing the testing for the channel a long time ago, I really, got to see the nuances of all these different blade types, which ones slice better than this and why. Like this thing slices really well because it has a very deep hollow grind on it, and it's not creating a wedge effect at all when you're cutting. Now, if you cut like thick rubber, cut apples all day, stuff like that, you're going to get more of a, wedge effect into it. And that's when thin geometry and thin stock will play a big part. Like this Rockwall thin blade stock. It's not the thinnest behind the edge, but keep it nice and sharp, and this thing will slice like nobody's business. This one, the Quiet Carry Drift. Is this the Drift? Yeah. Very thin blade stock. High flat grind. This thing slices outstanding. So basically what I'm asking, I want to know down below, what type of knives are you drawn to? Are you drawn to those overbuilt, thick, work style knives? And if so, why? And if you're drawn to the super slicers, let me know if so and why. Also, in that same breath, let me know what's your favorite in whatever category you choose. It's just something that I've always been interested in, because when I first got into the hobby, I was into those hard-used, overbuilt knives because I wanted my knife to be a tank. I wanted to be able to handle anything, you know, the zombie apocalypse. Well, as my taste changed over the last 20 years of being into knives, 20 plus years of being into knives, I've went through different phases, but I've always loved my excellent slicers. They always put the biggest smile on my face. That's why, you know, this Oz Machine Company Roosevelt is my favorite knife in my collection, because it's got decent thickness on the blade stock, not super thin, full flat grind, and it comes down to a nice thin edge, and this thing slices like nobody's business. Love this knife. So let's have a discussion down below. I want to see what y'all are drawn to, what type of knives you like the most and why, and what are some of your favorites in that category. Alrighty, I hope y'all enjoyed this video. Something just a little lighthearted. I'm still preparing for the top 10 of 2022 videos. Those are just stressing me out. All right, guys and girls, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, please leave them down below. I hope everybody's having an absolute amazing day. I will see y'all on the next one.